Hey everybody, it's Lavender Town, and today I'm going to be doing another Do This Not That, this time on backgrounds. This is something that was really highly requested, and it's been requested for a long time, and I've really been putting it off, mainly because I never thought I was particularly strong at backgrounds. But I do think that I'm finally at a point where I at least have enough tips and advice for you guys that I could make a useful video for you. So I'm starting off with the don't, and I actually reference some of my old art as a don't, because again, I really think that this is one of the things I struggled with the most, and I continue to struggle with. And the first thing I'm doing is drawing a character first. This is actually a pretty big don't, and a lot of people don't think about it, but if you're doing a piece that's really focused on a background, you shouldn't draw the character first, because you want to consider where the character fits in the drawing, and if you draw them first, then you're drawing everything around them rather than having an environment and then putting them naturally somewhere inside of it. So I just gave her sort of a basic front-facing pose. I know if you guys have seen my posing Do This Not That, which I did a couple weeks ago, you will sort of remember some of my tips about posing and not facing your character like straight towards the camera, especially if you want it to be sort of a dynamic or story driven illustration. So that's something I just threw in there because I mean, might as well pile on the don'ts. And I'm really focusing on her instead of the background. Now there's a couple other things I'm going to talk about that I intentionally did sort of wrong here, and then some things that I kind of accidentally did right, and I have to sort of go back and make them worse because I want to focus on all the mistakes you can make sort of at the same time. So one of the things I want to talk about is visual hierarchy. That just basically means as far as like shapes and colors and things, what dominates over other things, what sort of hides behind other things. This is something that's really important because it helps guide the eye. Now, my character is roughly the same size as a lot of these trees, and that's a problem because we don't have a clear visual hierarchy. This tends to cause the viewer's eye not to know where to go, and it makes the whole image feel more stable. Whereas if you have objects that are vastly different in size, you might find that the illustration is a lot more interesting. Another thing that I did was that I made some trees really, really small and far away, and then the rest of the trees quite large and the same size as the character. And this scaling is really uncomfortable because there's really no sort of subtle gradation of the trees going backwards. It's just two flat layers, one that's dramatically farther than the other. This isn't something that you see in nature, so especially in a nature scene, it looks really strange. I also made the horizon line quite low, which makes our character look like a giant for one, and it leaves us very little room to do interesting stuff with the ground that she's near. There are reasons to make the horizon line low and give you less space going backwards, but it needs to be a conscious choice, and in this case, it really doesn't make any sense. So now I want to work on the do side, and the first thing I'm going to do is actually add a step that I didn't do. Instead of going straight into a sketch, I'm going to make a very small square and quickly just do a super rough version of what I'm picturing in my head without worrying about details at all. This is called thumbnailing for those who don't know, and it's really, really useful just to see in a super, super small scale a very rough sketch of what you want. It gives you a better chance of like being able to quickly decide your scales and things like that. So once I'm happy with it, I blow it up and I start doing the sketch over top of my very rough guide. So the first thing I wanted to do was give the character something to interact with, and I decided that I was going to have her sitting on a log looking out into the swamp instead of looking away from everything and not interacting with anything. I think it makes the character feel more like she's a part of the world, because not only is she physically touching something other than the ground, but she is looking at something in this world, which also encourages the viewer to look as well. So now I'm adding in what's known as the Hiroshige element. It's named after an artist called Utagawa Hiroshige, who he was an ukiyo-e artist, and he was well known for adding these big foreground elements that come in front of what you would typically be looking at in a painting. So in that case, that's like our character, the midground of our painting. I put this large tree branch sort of cutting over it, and that gives the whole image a sense of greater depth. It also just makes the whole thing look a little more interesting because it cuts across the frame in an interesting sort of way and creates these little paintings that are separated from each other by the branch. Now, this isn't something you would always do, especially if you're doing a comic or something. It's not something you want to overuse, but I thought I wanted to talk about it, and it is something that can be quite beautiful if it's utilized right. So you'll see a bit more clearly what I mean once I get out of the sketching phase. So as I'm inking, I'm considering different things. I want to make sure that the character is going to pop out from the background because she is now much smaller in the image, so we have to use something other than her size to give her hierarchy. So what I decided to do is I put a lot more detail in her hair than I will in any other part of the painting, which will draw our eyes there. I'm also going to do some things with the color of her that will also help her pop out, but that is something that we'll be talking about once I get to the coloring stage. So I'm also trying to make sure that anytime something is resting on this ground, in order to show that it's grass, instead of just having a flat green that's assumed to be grass, I'm making sure to throw up a ruffled little line, like at the edge of each of these rocks and at the edge of a tree trunk, to show that there is grass there. That helps us assume that there's grass everywhere else, and it just makes everything look a little bit better and more detailed without actually having to draw in individual lines for every blade of grass, which you obviously don't want to do. I'm now coloring in this Hiroshige element and moving it around a little bit. I actually wish that I'd gotten even a little bit more into the painting or the drawing with this tree branch, but that's something that you can sort of decide as you're working, especially if it's digital and you could just scoot things around like I can. And as you can see, we have a lot more ground to look at because I've raised the horizon line quite a bit. So it gives us more space to see the entirety of this little swampy pond, and it gives us a lot more space to gradually move the trees backwards, which gives us a much more naturalistic feeling. And yeah, I'm just putting a lot more love and details into this one in general because that is the secret to making a convincing background. I was definitely very guilty of making my backgrounds very boring because I didn't want to spend time on them, but I promise there is a meditative sort of enjoyment to making lots of little details into your backgrounds, and it's something that you don't want to skimp away from. It can be the difference between your illustration looking good and looking great. I'm also adding little bits of lichen on the Hiroshige element branch because I just thought that it would make it a little more interesting. I didn't want just big black bars across the whole drawing. I wanted to make it very clear that it's this naturalistic element and make sure that it's really adding to the painting. So I also made a little path. I thought that that would give some more interest to the ground. Again, a big problem with these images is sometimes you have like grand swaths of sky or ground that are just not interesting at all, and you have to find ways to break them up and make them interesting. Otherwise, your eyes will just sink into those boring areas and it will actually draw your eyes away from the interesting parts, like the character and the other details that you put in. So now we're getting into the colors, and in the first one I intentionally picked some really problematic colors when it comes to balancing your character and your background, which is a huge struggle when it comes to backgrounds in character-based art. So I chose colors that were very close in value in this first painting. I wasn't thinking really about the values at all, and in fact it's making the art look very flat because they all have about the same value. So even though they're different colors, it's really sucking a lot of life out of the painting. What I'm going to do is I'm going to shrink down my painting a lot, or well, zoom away from it in my case, and just do a super rough color study on top, which basically means you're just like splotching in colors wherever you think they might look good and not worrying about the little details and just trying to get an overall vibe of what you want it to look like. Again, when you do this freely without, being pressured to put everything in the right place, it'll actually be easier for your brain to communicate to you quickly what you actually want. So this can give you a much closer image to what you're picturing in your head because you don't have to wait so long to get it all down. Basically, you can just look at that snapshot with your imagination and your inner eye and just put it down as fast as possible and not lose any of it. It's almost like trying to make sure that you remember a dream. You want to tell someone about it as fast as possible, otherwise you're going to forget parts of it. So once you've got your color key down, you can just turn that layer off and start picking up the colors that you decided and putting them in at your leisure. I chose some purples and oranges and things like that, and I'm just trying to add them in a much cleaner way so that it actually looks good by the end. I try some blending brushes here, but for some reason, even if I haven't selected anything that has any like white in it, it still selects stuff outside of the selection and has white smears all over the place, so I can't use that one properly, which I'm really annoyed about. But I just dropped that anyway and decided to put in some flat lighting details first. So this is definitely a lighting focused color key that I did. I was just trying to think about where sort of the sunsetty light would be coming from and how that would affect the shadows on my character. So that's the part that we're putting in first, basically all of the lighting stuff. I picked two sort of separate colors. I did pink and green because I like how they look together and because they look good in the color key. I like this bluish seafoamy kind of green. It's really like, it's a very pleasant color to me. I really like it. So I'm just putting all that in as neatly as I can without, going too overboard. And then I go back in to try and deal with the sky again because it was giving me trouble at first. That's just a general good art tip, by the way. If there's a part of your work that's really driving you nuts and you keep trying and it's like messing with you a lot, just take a break and do some other part of the drawing and then come back to it. I find that that's a foolproof way to get past those little hurdles. Sometimes the longer that you work on something that's frustrating you, the longer that you have to work on it, Like sometimes you're just stuck and it's better to step away or just do a different part of the drawing and then come back. I'm also using a technique in this piece where I put a clipping mask over my inking layer and carefully drew in some lighter colors over top of my lines, making the lines underneath much lighter. So I picked a slate sort of teal color that matches the colors that I'm using, and I'm just basically anything that's really far away, like the mountains, I'm making the line art lighter so that sinks back behind our character and gives us a greater feeling of like atmosphere and distance and stuff. That's a really easy trick when you're doing digital, and it's a lot harder when you're doing traditional, but it is definitely possible, especially if you have pens that are in lighter colors. I would recommend using them for background elements. It really helps those things sort of step behind the foreground elements, and yeah, it just gives your piece a lot more dimension. And I'm doing a lot of colored cast light. Anytime there's like a highlight, I make sure that it matches these orangey colors that are up in the sky, and I'm also sort of showing that glittering on the water as well. I try out some like gradient stuff on the water so that it looks more watery, though I think I decided to scrap that because I wanted the picture to look a little more storybook, and that was looking a little bit too like super digital. Almost like flash animation or something from the distant past, so I threw that out. You can actually see my lighter line art now that I turned those colors off, and at this point I'm actually doing in a separate layer the local colors, which basically just means the colors as basic as they are without any lighting affecting them. So everything is just sort of the color you would expect it to be, like the grass is green and the sky is blue and the mountain is gray, and I'm just basically coloring it in the most basic sense. That's how I did the do not drawing, but I didn't add anything after that, so it ended up looking a lot less interesting. So, but you'll see the effect of having a separate lighting and shadow layer over top of a basic color layer like this. I'm also making sure to use colors that aren't all the same value. And now you can see what it looks like when you put soft light color key over top, well, not the color key, soft lighting and shadow over top of local colors. It gives it this very lovely and soft sort of look, and it just looks a lot like, it just looks a lot softer and nicer, and it makes it feel like there's real light in this drawing, which you don't get at all with the drawing to the side. I try some vignettes and stuff, and I also, you can see that I took a white brush and cropped around the whole drawing sort of roughly. It makes it look a lot more storybooky and sort of nice. Remember, you don't have to make everything in a square, so that's just sort of an illustrative thing. If you want to make your thing look more like a painting or more soft or natural or whatever, you can just very easily make a little border around it, and it can look quite lovely like that. So lastly, I've done a red line over both of these so we can talk about the specific good and bad things in both of these drawings. So first of all, looking at the do not, I did a big red mark where there is just a big boring part of sky where nothing is happening. That's one of those dead areas I was talking about where your eye will just sort of sink into and it brings you away from everything that is good about the drawing. I also numbered the different elements so you can see how things are on very, like, not that many different planes. It doesn't feel like a gradual movement back into the space. It just feels like maybe two or three different layers of information. So like the girl and the trees beside her and then the trees in the back, which is just not a very good, it's just not a very good feeling. It's just way too flat. And I'm also showing how she is the same size as the trees, which is a problem because it looks weird and it makes her look too tall, and the horizon line does that as well. Also, you can see that the clouds are all the same size, which is just very boring. And on the good side, I'm showing you where all the layers are, and you can see that there's at least 6 layers separated from each other, which gives us a much more 3D feeling drawing. You can see how the different sizes of the tree and the character differentiate them. You can see where she's looking, which draws us back into the center of the drawing, which is a really good thing if you want to keep someone looking at your drawing for longer, which I think we all want deep down because we work really hard and spend a lot of time drawing the thing, and you never want someone to just glance at it and be like, oh yeah, it's good, when you've spent like hours and hours on something. That's something that used to bother me a lot. And lastly, I circled a point of contact where her hand is touching something in the world, which gives the world a sense of physicality that you can't get if your character isn't interacting with it in some way. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for staying until the end. I hope it was helpful. Like I said, I'm not the best at backgrounds. There's a lot of people who are way better at it than me, but as someone who's struggled with it a lot, I thought that my perspective on how to improve your backgrounds might be helpful because, I mean, maybe it's like one of those things where it's easier to learn from someone who wasn't naturally good at it so they can sort of remember what it was like to still be struggling. I'm hoping it was something like that and not just a blind leading the blind sort of scenario. But anyway, I hope you guys are having a lovely week, and I will see you next video. Thank you to my patrons, including Blep, Scott Peterson, Weeb, Code, Ellie Quiznak, Miss Misu, BB Dave, Gaia, Cato Cat, Christy Stewart, Paynamo, Elizabeth Albin, Calpompone, Rebel B, Taka, Disweet12, Harry Kitty Cat, Isabella Spooky, Death Global Zone, Lovely, Lachlan MD, Mystic, Vilka, Enzo Jobert, Your Boy ST, JJ Jade, Laura Buter, Super Pixel, Angela Taylor, Hallman Kearney, Pastel G-Man, Lib and Addie Visual. Thank you guys so much for your support.